Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear students, welcome to our class. So, inshallah, from today we will resume our classes, inshallah. And last class we stopped till the asexual reproduction in plants. And today, inshallah, we will see about sexual reproduction in plants and animals. So, we already know that sexual reproduction requires the fusion, that is joining of male and female gametes. Okay, gametes means sex cells, and now we will understand how the sexual reproduction takes place in flowering plants. So the reproductive organ, the reproductive organ of flowering plants, the plants that bears flowers. So the reproductive organ of that plants is the flower. Okay, so flower is the reproductive organ, and stamens which produce pollen are the male part. So there is a part in plant flower that is called as stamens or androecium. So these are the male part of the flower, and they produce pollen. Pollen is a small particle. Okay, so these pollen grains contain male sex cells. So there may be several stamens in each flower. So in each flower there may be a lot of this male part, and this each androecium, that is stamen, has two parts. Okay, so the upper part is known as anther, and this is the part which bears the pollen. You can see here. So this is the anther, that is the upper part, and it is held on a lower part called as filament. That's a filament. It is a lower part. It is used to held the anther. So the pistil or gynosium is the female part, and its basal part is the ovary carrying eggs or ovules or female sex cells. So the pistil or the gynosium is the female part. The parts of the pistil are the pistil, that is gynosium, has some parts: stigma, style, and ovary. In most plants, each flower bears both male and female parts. So in most plants, the flower contains both male and female parts. So those kind of plants are called as bisexual. In some plants there are male flowers with only androecium, and there are female flowers bearing only gynosium. These kind of plants are called as unisexual. And the next topic is going to be pollination and fertilization. So we now saw that how we now saw about the reproductive part of the plants, and now we will see about the pollination and fertilization, how the reproduction happens in these plants. So for the fusion of the nuclei, pollen and ovule are brought together. Pollen is the male part and ovule is the female part. They have to be brought together by several agencies. Agency means some factors like the wind. When wind flows, so they join together. Okay, the male part falls into the, that is pollen falls into the female part, and then this pollination happens, or through water, or through insects. When insects land on the male part, and the pollen grains, they get stick to their legs, and when they move to the female part, there the pollination happens. So this transfer of pollen grain from anther, that is the male part, to the stigma of a flower is called as pollination. So this is what is called as pollination. So self pollination is when the pollen of a flower falls on its own stigma and fertilizes the ovule. So the self pollination is when a pollen of a flower, okay, pollen is there in a flower, falls on its own stigma. So if it's a bisexual plant, it will have the female part, and it falls on its own stigma and it fertilizes the ovule. So this is called as self pollination. And there is something called as cross pollination. It is pollen from one flower falls on the stigma of another flower of a different plant of the same species. So there are same species plants, but there are different plants. So one this thing, pollen from one flower, that is male part, it falls into the stigma of another flower of a different plant, and then this fertilizes the ovule of the flower. Okay, so this is called as cross pollination. So for this process, agents like wind, water or insects help to transfer pollen from one flower to another. So here you can see this process called as fertilization in plants. This is the diagram representation. So what is fertilization? The fusion of the nuclei of pollen and ovule. So the pollen will have the nuclei and the ovule, that is female part, will have the nuclei. These two have to be fusion, that is joined together. This is what is called as fertilization. So the pollen is brought by any pollinating agent mentioned above, that is wind or insects or water, and this pollen is fallen onto the stigma of the pistil. So here you can see this is the stigma, and the pollen grain you can see on the above, and the nuclei, it produces pollen tubes, and then it reaches the nuclei of the ovule. Okay, then there the fertilization happens. So you can see the diagram and you will understand how this process happens. Okay, and if you want to see a detailed representation how it happens, you can search in on YouTube fertilization in plants. I want to see a clear picture. For here it is enough to understand how the process happens. So each pollen grain forms a pollen tube. As in the diagram you can see, it forms a pollen tube, and then this pollen grain through that pollen tube reaches the ovule, and the pollen tube pushes through the pistil. So you can see the pistil here, and pollen grain, the pollen tube pushes that pollen grain into that pistil, and then they join together, and the fertilized ovules, now they are joined and it is fertilized. Now this fertilized ovules develop into seeds. Okay, and then these seeds are capable of germinating into seedlings and into the new plants. That is the diagram here, 24.11. You can see after the this seed is germinated, you can see how the seedlings are formed, and then finally they grow into a plant. Okay, so in the first diagram, a gram seed to a new gram plant, how it happens, you can see, and here a maize seed to a new maize plant. You can see here how the process happens. So once the seeds are formed, they get dispersed or carried away from the parent plant. Okay, many times once the seeds are formed, either through wind or through human replacement, they are germinated under favorable conditions like water, like proper sunlight, everything. Then they grow into a new plant. So that is the sexual reproduction, pollination, fertilization, everything. And now we will see about sexual reproduction in animals. So if you see the lower animals like sponge and hydra, they can produce through asexual methods, which we saw earlier, but then they can also produce through sexually. Okay, but in all animals, the female produces eggs and the male produces sperms. This is how the process is, and then the egg and the sperm fuse to form the zygote. Once they are joined together, then that is called as zygote, and then this develops into the embryo, and the embryo, it develops into a full-fledged individual. This is how the process happens. So this happens inside the egg. So there are some animals that lay eggs, okay, include fish, frog, or some reptiles and birds, and these are called as oviparous. Those animals which lay eggs, okay, and then their offspring is born from there. It is called as oviparous. But in mammals like cats, dogs, cows and humans, the baby develops inside the mother's womb. Okay, so the mother's womb, the baby develops there. So these are called as viviparous. So this is the term they are called as. But in certain animals, like certain organisms like tapeworms and earthworms, the female and male sex organs will be present in the same individual. Okay, so they are called as hermaphrodite. But the sexes are separate in all other animals, and the male individual will have the male organs like testes, etc., and the female will have ovaries. Okay, so humans also belong to the animal kingdom. So humans are mammals, we know that, and that they are called as viviparous, as we mentioned earlier. So that's it for today's class. Inshallah, in the next class we will see about reproduction in humans, and we will see some other topics under this subtopics. Okay, then we will move on to the next topics, inshallah. So please study well. I will see you in the next class. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.